Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to reopen the Risk and Assurance Committee meeting, and I'd like to ask Councillor Zabelin to open the meeting with a karakia. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Me inoi tātou. Tūtaua mai I runga, tūtaua mai I raro, tūtaua mai I roto, tūtaua mai I waho. Kia tau ai te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, tāike.
Thank you, Councillor. I'd like to deal with housekeeping. So this meeting is being recorded and will be live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. There are housekeeping and safety procedures on the screens in front of you, setting out where the evacuation and assembly areas would be. Noting that smoking is prohibited, there is a defibrillator located at the foyer entrance, and please report any near-miss incidents to the committee administrator. I'd ask all online participants to keep their cameras turned on and their microphones muted unless addressing the meeting. Councillors have their voting devices and can comment or propose an amendment. Councillors online to use the hands up function. Any text for amendment should be emailed to the committee administrator if attending online. And the councillors that we're expecting online today are Councillor Hapita, Michelade and Councillor Meehan and Councillor Wood. Thank you. Moving on from those housekeeping matters, we have apologies today from Councillor Dennison. We also have an apology for early departure from our Mayor and
Early departure from Councillor Harper and Councillor Wood.
And we also have apologies for early departure from Councillors Hapita and Wood. Thank you. I'm unaware that there's a notification of additional items. I would like to move those apologies. Seconder. And thank you. And we'll put that to the vote.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. The Deputy Mayor's an apology as well. Thank you.
Okay, noted. Yeah. Noted anyway. Okay. So we'll move that to vote. Excuse me. And that's been carried. 11 for, none against, no abstentions. And I'm unaware we have no additional items. Are there any declarations of interest? And my understanding is there's no public comment today?
No, I haven't received any.
Good. Okay, so that takes us to confirmation of our minutes from the 18th of October 2023, dealing with the Part 1 public minutes. I'd like to move those. Do I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Naylor. Are there any comments or items, matters arising from those minutes anyone wishes to bring forward? No, then I'd like to put that recommendation to the vote. And that vote is 12 in favour, none against and no abstentions. I'd now like to move to the agenda and just, I note that we have circulated a run sheet today, but I'm also conscious that our meeting has been somewhat disrupted. So what we will do, given that we have our external auditor with us today, is we will go to the audit management report with action plan, which is agenda item 11 on page 67 of your distributed papers. And I'd ask for Debbie Pereira, Audit Director, Audit New Zealand, Masuma Actor and Cameron Mackay.
I've got Scott. Scott Manson will be.
Scott and Scott, welcome, taking over that, or standing in for Cameron today. So thank you for your report, and we're in your hands.
Cool. Afternoon all. Cam's had to duck home feeling a little bit unwell, so you're graced with my presence instead of his for this one. I'd like to take the report largely as read. Obviously following the annual report being audited and adopted in the last quarter of last year, we've worked with Debbie and her team on finalising the management report, and that's in the annexes today. So happy to take any questions unless Debbie's got anything to add.
Kia ora, everybody. I just wanted to highlight probably the key messages that we've got in the report. I won't go through in detail, but I'm happy to take any questions that you may have over it. Probably the key messages are that we issued an unmodified audit opinion over the financial statements for the year ended 30 June 2023. And we issued a modified opinion over some of the non-financial performance measures, and they were around the complaints measures, road smoothness, which was a new one for this year, and the response times to the complaints. So the first two, the response time to the complaints and the number of complaints is an issue that you've had for a number of years, and I know that you're currently working through these. The road smoothness one came up this year. There was a delay in getting the road smoothness count completed, and so this was going to be the third year that the same numbers were going to be reported against. So we made a note of that in our report. Council has since had that road smoothness completed, so we're confident that that won't be an issue for next year. We have 4 new recommendations, which you'll see on page 5 of our report. So one of them is around the road smoothness, which is underway. Vested assets, there were some vested assets that came, that were identified as being missed from the previous year, so the council had a prior period error in the financial statements. So the recommendation here is just around having a system to ensure that the section 224C certificates that are issued are actually reviewed so that those assets can be captured into council's finances. So these are assets that are vested to council from developers. And then lastly, the last 2 issues are around roading. So the roading valuation, there were a number of improvement actions that came out of the valuation, and we've just highlighted those for council to consider. And the depreciation accounting policy being in alignment with the value. So we didn't have any concerns around the depreciation itself. It was more just that the policy was in alignment. I also just wanted to note that there were very few corrected misstatements, and mainly everything was adjusted apart from one vested asset, and that was because it came up at a late stage and it wasn't material. So I did want to acknowledge council for the good set of draft accounts that was received and very few changes that came out of it. But happy to take any questions.
And questions? Councillor Zavalin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all. I had a question about the road smoothness survey in relation to our quarterly performance reports, and that is one of the, or smooth travel exposure is one of the measures we have, and our target's greater than 80%. Have we been receiving the same figures from the same survey over the last 2 or 3 years in the absence of having an updated survey?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thank you, councillor. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, at least initially, of officers looking forward around road smoothness surveys. What level of resourcing is in the long-term plan, and what frequency can we expect for those surveys in the future?
They're done every 2 years, and I understand that the one that we need to do has been done this financial year already. So it will be scheduled for year 2 of the LTP. Following on.
And that setting around every 2 years is
Standard practice.
controlled by, like, is it a decision that council's made, that it's a statutory thing?
Statutory, Chris, if I... Best practice, probably. Chris, do you have any? No. Would have to check what guides that, but maybe Debbie.
Yeah, I could just make a comment on that. Your performance measures are, you have the target each year. So ideally you'd be doing it on a yearly basis, but it's recognised practice that a council will do it over a couple of years, because you may not survey the same, but it might take a couple of years to get your whole roads surveyed. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. That's helpful to understand that. Couple comments in here around the performance reporting, and an indication that either something is coming that's separate from K-Base, or that K-Base is being reinvented or something. So could I just get a bit of comment to understand what's happening?
So there's a contact centre modernisation piece of work that's underway at the moment. K-Base is the system that's used by the contact centre and pushes all the service requests out to the organisation. That's been replaced, so the software is written in a workflow way that'll be easier for officers to use and record and things like that. I've got nods from Kerry Lee over behind you, so that means I've hit the mark.
And thanks. And do we know what that will look like then in terms of reporting out to council?
It's probably a touch early to say, but that project is underway right now.
Thank you. Finally, just wanted to ask, in the last pages of this particular report, there's the action plan, and actions are indicated as either completed, not started, or in progress. And I wondered if there had been consideration for identifying whether actions were on track as opposed to simply in progress, and would that be something that could be provided to elected members?
Absolutely. We can come back to you on that one.
So
It's not been recognised on the plan itself, but we do have that information.
great, so it could simply be transferred into reports in future.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, great, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, councillor. I also had a couple of questions. Debbie, thank you for coming today. It's good that you're here in person. In your mind, what were the 2 or 3 material matters that required judgment, and was there debate or contention in and around any of those matters in the preparation of the financial statements last year?
Yes, so in our report on page 11, it really sets out the significant areas of risk that we see. So the first one was the complaints and the response times. So there wasn't an area of contention around that. It was an acknowledgement. Probably the next thing that it's the big one every year, and it's the fair value of your assets. So council has a very large asset base, with particularly with infrastructure assets, And last year it was the roading assets that were revalued. So that does take a lot more work. There's a lot of judgment around unit prices, around condition of assets. There's also the inputs with the age of the asset. And so we do a lot of extra work around revaluations in a revaluation year. But there wasn't anything that was contentious around it, but it was a process that we had to go through, and we were satisfied with the valuation that came out. For assets that aren't on a revaluation cycle, there's also the requirement to ensure that the fair value hasn't changed, and maybe that could be an increase in value because of market movements or an impairment of the assets if there's been an issue. So there's a fair amount of work that goes around that too. But we didn't have any contentious issues around that. We were satisfied with the work that was done. The other thing that we have for all councils and all entities is risk of management overrides. So by that, we will do particular work around journals or non-standard journals around balance date. Anything that's got an estimate in it that could be subject to management bias, we will review those in particular. And we didn't have any concerns around anything there. One other thing that did take a little bit of time was the vested assets and the work that was required around ensuring that the amount that you recognised in your accounts was correct. So, and that was something that we worked through with management. So not contentious, but just a little bit of extra work.
Thank you for that. So, Debbie, when you step back and look forward to this year's audit,
Yeah.
is there anything that you feel has changed or that this committee should be aware of as regards that process or be thinking about?
So we will still have the same significant risks. The risks around the valuation of assets will always be a risk. The additional thing that we will have this year is around your new FMIS and the transfer of the balances from the last time, looking at the controls around the new systems and looking to see what we can rely on. In the first year, we will be taking more of a substantive approach as we get to review the systems and any issues that council may have had will be ironed out. But that will be a big area of focus for this coming year.
And for this coming year, when will this committee see the plan, the audit plan, engagement plan?
Yeah, so we're in the process of planning at the moment, and so we are expecting to get the audit plan to you for your May committee meeting.
Thank you for that. There are no further questions, so I'd like to move the recommendation that the Risk and Assurance Committee receive the memorandum titled Audit New Zealand 2023 Management Report with Action Plan presented on 6 March 2024 and seconded by Councillor Naylor. So is there any comment? Councillor Zaberlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank you for the report. It was very interesting to me, and I have had some concerns about the use of narrative measures in our quarterly performance reports, but this report has highlighted for me possible inadequacies in our quantitative measures, particularly if it needs to be made explicit that if we have a percentage measure, in this case it says 84% road smoothness for the 2022-23 year, in the absence of a survey, I'd really appreciate some detail as to how that calculation has been made, because I think it lacks a little visibility and accountability for the score that we've given ourselves, not necessarily backed up by showing the working of how we've reached that score. I think it leads me sort of to question some of the other percentages and scores we may have given ourselves. So just thank you for this report and for highlighting that, and I'll be paying close attention to that going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. The queue is empty, so I think we can now put this recommendation to the vote. So that's been carried unanimously. And we'll now move to item 7, setting council's risk management appetite and tolerance levels. And I'd like to welcome Stephen Minton, Risk Management Advisor, and Jason McDowell, Head of Risk and Resilience, to the table. We're in your hands, gentlemen, so please proceed.
Good afternoon, councillors. Thank you, Mr Chair. As council continues through our risk management journey, we're now at a stage to present and work through with committee our risk appetite and tolerance. We'll take this paper as read, and if you've had any questions, we're happy to take those questions.
Thank you. Councillors, questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Jason. Just interested, the next steps outlined here suggest a triennial basis for review. I just wondered what the resource implications would be if we wanted to have a higher tempo of review, say annually.
Well, yeah, Stephen Minton, Risk Management Advisor. I mean, it's not a huge amount of work to do a review. I mean, the large amounts of work are done through the creation of the risk register and the original risk management framework. A review of the tolerances themselves, probably not a huge amount, although I'm not entirely sure if there'd be any significant outcomes, because the needle's not something that moves quickly, which is in part why we'd only do it triennially.
Thanks. I guess where I'm going with it is if there's elected members that have a level of discomfort with what's being proposed in terms of those bans, what options do we have to avoid locking ourselves down for 3 years and accepting that for 3 full years before climbing back in and having a conversation?
At any stage, committee could put a resolution through for a review, which we'll be able to complete and bring back in and work with elected members to revisit and move the needle if necessary.
Thank you. Moving then to the table in 3.1, do we have an understanding, especially towards the right-hand side of those bars that are crossing 3 boxes, kind of how much of the weight, let's say, for lack of a better word, of that risk kind of sits in that right-hand third versus the middle third versus the left third for, say, something like legal compliance?
The way that we'd probably measure this is through the actual operational risk registers and where the landing spots are. And as we've gone through and created the risk registers, there are some that are well below our risk appetite and some that are on our risk appetite and some are above. I'd probably suggest without sort of having the numbers in front of me, we're probably a little bit towards the higher end at this point as we've gone through that initial risk assessments and identified areas for improvement. But then obviously that work as it goes on around reducing those risks brings it back further down to the left.
So to be clear then, this is setting out a desired state rather than an actual state.
No. So what this is, the risk appetite is where we see our what the risk appetite is that we want. This is not what we're saying are the actual risk settings.
And so, I guess how do we marry up kind of desired state with actual state?
That's through the risk assessment process and the risk registers that are created at an operational level. And then there's also, as we get into the next paper, there's also the strategic risks where we measure where we are from a risk perspective and then present that as a residual risk.
Okay, that's all helpful, thank you. I wanted to ask about reversible environmental damage and what the definition of reversible environmental damage is versus presumably irreversible environmental damage.
if I might actually defer to my colleague who's the climate change one, perhaps. David Watson, sort of more, this is more his sort of space, perhaps, if I can.
Thank you.
David Watson, Senior Climate Change Advisor. So when we're talking about environmental damage profiles, it tends to be those situations where you would lose a core function or those elements of an ecosystem that would be very difficult to come back on its own. You'd need to do some kind of translocation process or bring in species from outside to fill in niches within a system that would have been lost due to the damage or pollution events. So essentially, if you were to put a big fence around it and leave it to get on with its own processes, you wouldn't necessarily go back to a similar state that you had prior to the event occurring. You'd have to make interventions. That would be considered a sort of an irreversible or difficult to reverse process.
And I guess I'm trying to understand why if I've read it correctly, we're kind of limiting ourselves to reflecting on reversible environmental damage and not irreversible environmental damage.
I think the risk framework under the consequence tables has got both categories. If you turn to the consequence tables, we do talk about both reversible and irreversible damage. So if we look at moderate consequences for environmental, it talks about reversible environmental impacts.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that on notice to dig further into that space. I think that's me for questions, Mr. Chair, but just to indicate that I would have an appetite for seeing an annual revisit rather than triennial, and will provide a recommendation accordingly.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you for the report. I also have a question which I will ask now because I think it's related to some of the earlier discussion. My question is, on a go-forward basis, will this committee get a chance to assess key strategic risks, understand mitigation, and debate residual risk?
I guess the answer is yes. The intention is that the strategic risks will all be, and we'll get into this a little later, will be documented, including an assessment of the current residual risks, the current controls and any improvements. And the intention is that will be an ongoing topic for presentation to this committee.
So therefore, Stephen, for example, because what's one person's low risk may not necessarily equate to another's view of the world, there will be a more practical, fact-based view of the level of residual risk across the various categories of risk categories on an ongoing basis. So it would be possible for elected members to debate at that point whether they were happy with that level of residual risk or not.
Yes, they would, and through the presentation of the individual strategic risks, the risk management process also sort of being an iterative process. They're always under review, and we would expect the needle maybe slowly or maybe not so slowly to move one way or the other every time we do undertake a review.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Councillor Harpiter? Okay, how's that? Councillor Harpiter, your question?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. My question relates to page 22 of the document. It's looking at that matrix for risk criteria. Under your performance capability, it talks about, for turnover, it talks about industry average. So what is industry average for turnover? And how does that compare with what we've currently got at the City Council? There's a lot of jargon in here.
Yeah, I mean, I think People and Performance do have industry turnover rates and also our own turnover rates. If we went back perhaps say 18 months ago, we would probably say that we are somewhat higher than the industry average, but that's perhaps a economic situation from 18 months ago. I think that the current state of our turnover rates has improved substantially since then. But there is publicly available data around what constitutes an average industry turnover rate.
So why wouldn't we put a figure in rather than putting an industry rate in? Why couldn't we put an actual figure in?
Well, I guess when we created these consequence tables, we did consider how other councils also do it, and this was a pretty common approach. Also, over time, you will find, I guess, that industry averages may change as well, and therefore having a multiplier of the average industry is a more permanent way of assessing it versus industry. I mean, industry rates now might be considered to be lower than they were 18 months ago, and so we use that multiplier as a better judge of where we are.
But if we were reviewing it on a regular basis, then we wouldn't, I mean, we just need to apply it to ourselves rather than applying it to some other milestone that doesn't even relate to what we are doing.
We do take some of the industry turnover rates as from our peers as well. So, local government turnover rates would be a point that we'd measure against.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Harpeter. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Thanks for the report. Just looking at the top of page 16 at the risk appetite table, how did we land on all of those places for those categories?
I guess it's been a combination of research and seeing what other organisations of our type have as a risk appetite. It wasn't easy to find what all the councils are doing around what their actual risk appetite is, but sort of research around what other, I guess, publicly funded organisations are doing for risk appetite and the general narrative in the communities around risk management, around where someone of our type of organisation should be. And also the sense of where officers felt that appetite should fall, given we are a publicly funded organisation. Ultimately, of course, it is all very subjective, and therefore it's an educated, informed view of where we feel we should be landing based on those factors.
Thank you. So any elected member input on that to date in terms of where those have been placed?
Not to date, except that now obviously we are presenting here.
Yep.
And so we take feedback here in this committee.
So just looking at what would the process look, say for example, I mean, I'm looking at that and the service delivery one, I mean, everything's very much risk averse, which I think aligns, sorry, getting into comment there, but I'm generally comfortable. But if we wanted to test in terms of service delivery at being a little bit further, increasing the risk appetite for that, particularly looking at the implications of that on the next page, what would that process look like? Would you be wanting us to do a resolution here, or is there another mechanism for us to have to get a bit more of a view of all elected members, or how would that look if we actually wanted to move the dial a little bit on that?
I guess there are two things I'd like to say. Firstly, it probably would need to be a resolution, but secondly, I think what you need to focus on is that management actions are going to be driven principally by risk tolerance as opposed to risk appetite, because while the risk appetite gives an indication of where we'd like to be, the tolerance is the line to which management actions will operate.
So they're all medium except for one. So
Yes.
it's quite a general.
Yeah, we do have that granularity of 5 different levels. And so if you look at risk management frameworks across the industry and across all industries, they range from sort of 3 to 5, and in very rare cases they may have 6. Given we've got that 5 by 5 matrix and 5 different levels, it does give us a reasonable degree of granularity compared to perhaps some of the other types of ways of measuring it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Thanks, Jason and Stephen. Stephen, were you aware that there was an elected member workshop on risk appetite?
On risk appetite.
Yeah.
There was a workshop held last year that I was involved with, if that's the one you're referring to.
Yeah.
Yes.
In that workshop, elected members made comments and expressed opinions as to where we should be sitting in the risk appetite that you've got in 3.1. But in your answer to Councillor Naylor, you said that there hadn't been any elected member input. So how do those two things add up?
The framework was created before that workshop, and I don't think there's been changes to that appetite since then. So I guess the answer is perhaps we overlooked that feedback at that workshop, but the framework was already in place then.
That certainly was my feeling, as one who gave substantial feedback at that workshop, that feedback hasn't been taken on board in the paper that we've got in front of us. So are you saying that that's probably a fair assumption?
I would say that the paper that we have in front of us today is where that feedback is being sought more formally from the committee.
So what was the value of the workshop in that case?
Well, the workshop wasn't just on risk tolerance and appetite, it was on risk management in its entirety.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So we have a recommendation before Council as tabled in the papers, but we also have an additional recommendation which has been moved by Councillor Barrett and seconded by Councillor Fitzgerald, that the committee review risk, appetite and tolerance levels annually. We need to vote separately on each.
No, we can take them together.
So I think we could move those two recommendations. Do I have a seconder?
Barrett wants to move.
Oh, well, and seconded. Are we? And we'll throw this matter now open to comment, councillors. Councillor Johnson.
Mr Chair, I must admit I am somewhat disappointed that the time and input of elected members in a workshop has not seemed to have had much, if any, consideration in the drafting of this paper, and particularly around risk appetite. I recall the workshop quite well, that there was a variety of opinion, which I'll acknowledge I was probably at one end of, but others were perhaps at the other end of. But I would just like to say that my understanding of workshops is that they're an opportunity for elected members to provide informal feedback and commentary, and that officers would consider those comments in the production of the report to council. So when a report comes to council and there's been no input, no effective input anyway, I suppose, into something as significant as determining risk appetite for the council, then I find that quite disappointing, to be honest. So I'm not feeling very comfortable with how this has panned out. And I'm not quite sure how to rectify that in the moment. I'll give some thought to it. But at the moment, I'm not inclined to agree to the recommended risk appetite and risk tolerance levels because I don't feel that the feedback and input of elected members has been considered and included in it.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and would concur with what Councillor Johnson's just said, and similarly struggled with how we actually proceed. I think that the appetites in particular are quite concerning to me, especially if there's some cases where those weightings are quite even across there, and we're actually seeing quite a bit of the weight of that risk sitting towards the neutral space and things like legal, environmental, reputational, etc. And I struggle too with where do we go from here, because we had a good crack in the workshop, and it seems a bit like water off a duck's back so far. So what I'm hoping is that we can use the year in front of us to paint more informed pictures around some of these areas, give us some practical, tangible examples in some of these areas so that we can know actually, you know, at a practical level, what does all this mean, so that it's not just a gut feel, because I'll tell you, my gut is very strong on not having a neutral view around something like legal risk. I'm quite averse, frankly. And so I need to know really what sits in that neutral space, what the actual implications of those kind of things are. So I think, you know, being a bit unwilling to go at this line by line, trying to amend things in the absence of anything much more than gut feelings, is why I've asked for the second recommendation. You know, I'm not prepared to let this sit for 3 years. To be honest, I'm probably not prepared to support what's on the papers, but sensing that it's likely to go through as an administrative matter, I think we need to have it in front of us in a more serious way within 12 months so that we can really prosecute the arguments around whether it is acceptable for this city to be wearing those levels of risk in areas as critical as the ones outlined to us. So I'd ask for your support on the second recommendation and would indicate that I'm unprepared to support the first.
In which case we will take these two recommendations separately. Councillor Zeblin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, likewise, I think this comment's just really for the sake of saying it, and at risk of repeating myself in former committees, but it is a specific comment that relates specifically to risk tolerance and not to appetite, and specifically with the environmental risk tolerance, because in terms of tolerance, don't really have much of a quarrel with the others, and I accept the view that you have to have some risk in some of these areas, but given that this report tells us that the risk tolerance reflects the acceptable variation in outcomes that's related to specific objectives, and as we've heard from Stephen, the management actions will be guided by our tolerance levels, it's setting a line that we'll endeavour not to cross. And having a look at the risk criteria and consequence table that outlined environmental risk as varying degrees of damage to land and waterways, ecosystems, species, and erosion or damage to properties. So the environmental impacts can have significant adverse impacts on people where we have pretty much a zero tolerance for risk, and on our infrastructure, and then by degrees on our finances. We need better controls to be able to protect our people and mitigate the risk to their properties. So I'm very, very interested to know what our iwi partners Rangitane would have to say about this particular tolerance setting, given their excellent environmental management plan clearly articulates our respective roles as kaitiaki and fundamentally as beneficiaries of a functioning environment. So if we persist with a medium tolerance for damage to our lands and waterways and ecosystems and species and damage to our properties as trade-offs for achieving our objectives, then in my view, we are letting our iwi partners do the heavy lifting while we sort of have a too low bar and are mostly talk. It's just highly inconsistent to say that we have no tolerance for risk to human safety, yet a medium tolerance risk for the lands and properties on which the humans depend on for their lives and livelihood. So in setting a line in which we will endeavour not to cross, a medium risk is not a view that I can find as sensible or responsible. This risk setting should be low, so I'll struggle to support this as well, though I am very happy to support the second recommendation there. Thank you. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Smith.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair, and apologies for my early departure, but I thought I'd better hang around for this because it was heading into some uneasy waters. I was at the workshop. In fact, I think I might have chaired it. So I think this is relatively reflective of the majority of what people, councillors around the table, and I appreciate that some of you have different opinions, and some of you are coming from some quite political viewpoints around this, and I perhaps do think you may be reading slightly too much into it. Because if we do pull back, and it is actually, on the whole, very risk adverse, and so it should be. But I'll just give you an example. We will have no external funding. We will pull back on our social media. We'll have to do a whole lot of things if we start turning this dial back. And I appreciate the comments that you've made are consistent to the comments you made, the three members that have spoken already, in the workshop. There was more that actually spoke the current setting that's there. So I think you've got a choice to do what you want to do in terms of voting. By and large, this is very risk adverse for a council of our nature. We've got to deliver services. We've got to deliver infrastructure. We've got to do some stuff which, by and large, means people need to go out and do stuff. We'll achieve nothing if we pare everything back into number 1 or 2, which I know some of you probably want to go to. So I'm sorry, but the majority did want to do, were quite comfortable with perhaps a few things that need to be tweaked. I don't mind having a look at this on a yearly basis, but to be honest, councillors, the dial might not be turned that much because there is quite a lot to go through. So this is what we discussed in the workshop. I was at a different workshop and some of my colleagues were at another one. It actually was what we discussed. Views were different. I accept that. I suppose you can do what you want to do in terms of voting, but I'm quite happy to vote for these. I think we've got to. It's risk adverse, and we need to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I think this is a really good framework. I think this is good work, a good starting point. I think it would be good perhaps to explore a little bit better how we come to a collective view on some of these. Certainly I recognise there'll be some varied views around the table. It is very risk averse, and generally I am quite risk averse, but when I looked at this I actually felt, particularly around the service delivery, that we could actually move the dial to having a slightly higher risk appetite for that one, particularly when you look at the implications on page 18 of having a low risk appetite for service delivery, significant increase in costs to meet greater service delivery goals, potential stifling of innovation, including productivity gains. If we actually were prepared to have a little bit of an increased tolerance on that particular one, I think that would create some opportunities. So I think, yeah, it is really risk averse. I think perhaps, of course, on things like health and safety and cultural and financial, I think those should be well to the risk averse end, but I would be interested in us exploring a little bit more like what that could look like if we were a bit increased our risk appetite in terms of service delivery. I'm not at a point where I'm prepared to put something on the table to debate today. I think I don't really have a view. I missed that workshop, don't have an understanding of what the collective view might be on that. But just putting it out there that I think that would be something useful to explore, and if we could find a mechanism to perhaps understand the collective view a little bit more simply than thrashing something out in this chamber by someone putting it forward, then I think that would be useful to this process going forward.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wood.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just thought it'd be worth commenting briefly if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Just worth commenting briefly in response to Councillor Zabella and Councillor Barrett, who've raised some valid points around the environmental risk. I want to put my RMA Commissioner hat on here for a moment, because what it talks about under the moderate risk in the table on 22 is localised minor and reversible damage to land. And I think we need to leave ourselves some space. So it's not a sense that I'm neutral to environmental risk. But if we look at something, for example, like wastewater treatment plant, where we're going to buy a significant amount of land to then disperse sewage over, there quite possibly is going to be temporary reduction to species. But under the RMA, under a lot of the planning that we have, it gives us the ability to offset or to mitigate those environmental risks. So rather than simply saying, well, we're not going to give ourselves the opportunity to create that risk at all, potentially, if there is species which will be offset by a project such as that, it can then be offset by another program in a different area, for example, a wetland, as we've done in other spaces. So I think it's important we do leave ourselves some flexibility when it comes to the environmental space. I don't think anybody here is sitting around the table going, we want to be doing irreversible damage or even moderate damage to the environment. But I think in terms of giving ourselves opportunities and options when it comes to the projects we're delivering, that's would be my take on why it's been left in that space, rather than simply a case of that we accept that happening. I think it's more around optionality. One thing I would comment on is the different language that's used in this report. So in terms of risk appetite, it's called neutral. Risk tolerance, it's called medium. And then risk consequence, it's called moderate. So we end up having a discussion where we're using three different words to describe sort of the same thing, which makes it quite difficult, because when Councillor Barrett says, I don't have a neutral appetite toward legal compliance, I agree. I'm not neutral on legal compliance. I want us to be fully compliant with almost no exception. But it's not a case of being neutral in feeling, it's a case of being moderate in our acceptance of the potential consequences, or that we would potentially accept a moderate consequence. So I think it's, certainly to me, I find it difficult to have a good discussion when the language has a number of different connotations in what it's implying, because neutral versus medium versus moderate all have very different connotations and interpretations that people use. So I want to say, when we're approving, if we approve these risk categories, my appetite is not neutral to any of it, but my risk tolerance is moderate toward the majority of it. So that's why I'm happy to support it, and happy to support it coming back each year to give other councillors some confidence that they'll have an opportunity to then feed back into this if it doesn't work, or if there are consequences that we don't expect today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hancock. Sorry, can I shift you over?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I've just really got a question, and it's really just to kind of sort of give us a bit of a steer from council officers. If we actually rejected the first recommendation, what do council officers see as a pathway forward in terms of determining our risk tolerance and appetite in the interim until we actually come back and actually review it in, say, a year's time?
Would you care to comment, Wade?
Through the Chair, perhaps can I answer that after you've voted on the matter?
No.
Thank you. What we would more than likely do if that recommendation one didn't make it up is that we will need to be bringing back another conversation to you about how it is that we manage risk in this organisation.
Thank you, Wade. Look, I suppose just by way of comment, I was actually at the workshop, and I'm looking at sort of the risk appetite matrix there. I absolutely remember councillors being totally risk averse in terms of health, safety and wellbeing. And if I recall, actually, Councillor Wood actually was encouraged councillors to be quite bold in terms of seeking a greater risk appetite in terms of certain things. So I think it probably reasonably reflects what it is that we came to collectively, I guess, in that workshop. But I suppose the missing part of the report is the oversight of recognising that our councillors, actually elected members, did actually have some input to it. So I think that probably is just an oversight. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. My view on this is that we have to start the conversation and start moving forward, and we need a place to commence from. In my mind, the absolutely key thing is that on a quarterly basis, elected members get a chance to understand the significant strategic risks in the business, understand the level of mitigation, form a view on the residual risk, and recommend a change or accept what management are presenting. So until we can start that debate and refine, we'll keep spinning our wheels. So I actually support this. I agree that, we will improve as we go. One of the key things is that we'll start understanding the language and the meaning, and things will evolve. But until we start on a process, on the journey of embedding risk management and getting a governance oversight and input into it, we're not fulfilling our function. So no beginning will be perfect, in my view, and my sense of it is that we won't be looking at and reviewing things on an annual basis. It should be more frequent than that, because our environment changes all the time. Risks come and go, they increase, they decrease. So on that basis, I think we should support the recommendations as tabled. There are no further comments. Councillor Johnson. You're on.
Thank you. Just to make one further comment, which is that the table that we were shown in the workshop, I've just checked back to last year, with the risk appetite is exactly the same as the table that is in this report. So no modification of that has been made at all. I'd just like to be clear about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Are there any further comments? No? So I think we are putting these recommendations separately, so we'll vote on recommendation. The Council agree the recommended risk appetite and risk tolerance levels as noted in section 3.1 and 3.2 of the memorandum titled Setting Council's Risk Management Appetite and Tolerance Levels, presented to the Risk and Assurance Committee on the 6th of March 2024. And we have that carried 8 for, 4 against, with no abstentions. And we'll now move to the second recommendation, which if you can just bring that up, please. That the committee review risk appetite and tolerance levels annually, and we'll put that to the vote. And that is carried 12-4 with none against and no abstentions. So I think at this juncture we're due a cup of tea. I'd recommend that we keep that to a minimum of 15 minutes, and we'll commence with item 8 immediately afterwards. Thank you. and we'll deal with item 8, setting council's strategic risks, and we'll welcome back Jason McDowell and Stephen Minton. So we're in your hands.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we present a first draft or first version of some strategic risks that have been identified for the organisation, or for the council. We want to be aware that this is an ongoing process where some of these strategic risks may change, may have additional risks added and identified through this process over the coming risk and assurance meetings, and we are, I guess, open for feedback and any questions. Do you have anything you'd like to say? Cool, so thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Questions, councillors? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back, gentlemen, and thank you. You might not be surprised to know that my first question is just around the tempo of review. 5.2 says there will be regular review. Is that annually, triannually?
So it's intended that at each risk and assurance committee there'll be certainly the risk on a page, so a summary of the risk statement, looking at the controls and mitigations, and if there's any improvements that have been identified by management, an opportunity for the committee to ask questions in that space. The intention would also be for the committee to see the risks, and if there are any feedback or like us to explore and provide any further information about any risks that are apparent or new that are either coming from officers or from yourselves, we can explore those and present on a continuous process at
Great.
subsequent meetings.
Cool. No, that gives us a good sense of that. Thank you. I guess, how do we get to 10? Is there a right number of risks to have in a statement? Why is there not 5 or 20?
It's not excessive compulsive disorder, but it's just a number that we ended up by pure accident landing on. We have to come up with 10. We just came up with a list and it just happened to be 10. If it was 9, it would have been come up as 9.
And I guess to your point around it being draft, if there's something on the list that we think doesn't need to be, or if there's something else we'd like to see on the list, this is kind of that opportunity.
And in fact, there is no right or wrong answer.
Yeah, great, thanks. Can I then turn to specifics? I guess I'd like to understand what consideration was given to loss of trust in public institutions being a strategic risk?
So we did consider, for example, whether reputational risk, which I guess is in a similar vein to what you're talking about, is a strategic risk. We see reputational risk being more as a risk driver than a risk in its own right, and therefore the strategic risks may be driven by reputational risk.
Can I ask because there is kind of this lexicon around risk that I don't yet fully understand, and I'll need a dictionary at some point, but when we talk about reputation, are we talking about kind of likability, popularity, or are we actually talking about something deeper like trust?
I think we describe reputation also public disquiet with the organisation to a greater or lesser extent.
And would that be reflective of trust in your view?
Yes. Lack of trust being public disquiet.
Yes, obviously, yes. Thank you. The inverse correlation. Look, that's helpful, I guess, to understand that it was considered and in officers' judgment didn't quite get there. So in terms of, I guess when you talk in 3.1 about how you did the analysis, like, was there any engagement with, for instance, elected members? Revisiting the recent conversation?
So this particular list of strategic risks has actually only been created this year. So this is our first cut of strategic risks, and so there wasn't the opportunity prior to that to have that engagement. I guess this is the engagement, and we're open to other things to be considered as additional strategic risks
Yep,
if they fall into that, what we would categorise as a strategic risk.
great, thank you. I think that's probably satisfied me in terms of questions, but I'd indicate to the chair that I would like to test the room's appetite around council adding loss of trust in public institutions to this list.
Thank you, councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Just trying to, I guess in my own mind, understand what might be included and where it might be included. I've got a couple of examples of things that might go wrong, and could you tell me whether they would be included in any of these risks, or are they some other category? So if, for instance, we had an adverse audit, would that be a significant risk, a strategic risk under your framework, or does that come under the operational risk?
I'd say it probably comes under operational risk. I mean, if we go back a step and decide how do we categorise what a risk event is, I mean, a risk event is something that interferes or stops your achievement of goals and objectives. It would probably be an enterprise risk that sits at the operational level.
So that wouldn't come under risk one, failure to meet financial obligations then? That's more about funding, according to your descriptor.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely it depends on the degree of failure from the audit report. If the failure of an audit report meant that there was the inability to raise funds, then that might be, but that would be sort of blue sky type things.
Okay.
What we look for is within reason, things that may happen.
So the other one I wanted to ask about was legislative non-compliance. In your description of on page 33, it seems it would only be an issue if it resulted in a loss or legal penalty. So the fact that we were legislatively non-compliant, if it didn't result in a loss or legal penalty, is that not, that would not come under a strategic risk?
When we do the risk assessments at strategic, we would also consider the reputational damage, so that may have a bearing on the overall risk rating, the reputational damage that could accrue from a breach of legislation.
So to build then on Councillor Barrett's point, how would we be able to consider that kind of a consequence if reputational risk isn't in the strategic risk?
Because it's a consequence and also a driver. It's not a risk in itself necessarily.
Okay. In terms of, let's say, if council was had a government observer or was taken over by government.
Commissioner.
Yeah, commissioner. Is that covered under your strategic risks?
So when we look at the risk consequences under legal and compliance, that's one of the more severe rating determinants for legal risk, appointment of a commissioner.
So, and you would consider that under risk 8, under judicial review and reputational damage, but there's nothing there around, you know, further steps than that. I'm just struggling to reconcile the strategic risks that you've identified and the descriptions that you've given with the sorts of strategic risks that I have in my own mind that are uppermost in my mind as to things that could go seriously wrong for council at a strategic level.
So talking about, for example, the appointment of a commissioner,
Yeah.
I wouldn't see that as a risk, I'd see that as a consequence. Because it's the outcome of the risk event.
And what risk event do you see it as being the outcome of?
financial mismanagement, for example, or breach of legislation, which I think this example has been documented in New Zealand recently.
Yes, but it's not in your, it's not a descriptor in your table that starts on page 31. So just, from a governance perspective, to be able to understand whether these things are being considered and factored in is quite tricky when you don't see them described or they're not listed as a risk.
So at the next committee, there will be presentations on one or two or some of the strategic risks that have the detail there. So it's the deep dive of what the issues are and the potential failures. Where there's a bow tie analysis that's done on the causes and consequences of the risk event. And it would then also include an assessment of the controls and the ratings and any action plans. So that visibility will be coming up to this committee next time.
Well, that's good to hear. I just wonder how I can agree the strategic risk statements without having that further information.
Like I said, these risk statements are, I guess, fluid to a degree, that they can be added or subtracted to. And so, for example, if a full presentation on a particular strategic risk is made and you feel that, or this committee feels that changes are necessary, then changes will be made if appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Harpeter. You're on mute, Councillor.
Are they
Councillor, could you start again? Sorry, you were temporarily muted.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I've just got one question, and thanks, Mr. Chair. I've just got one question. Are they ranked? Is this the list that we've got? Are they ranked?
No, there's absolutely no ranking whatsoever. It's just the order they came out in for no particular reason.
So will you be doing that so that we know? So say risk number 6, which talks about fatalities, would that be over any other risk?
We hadn't intended, there will be a degree of visibility around ranking on the basis of what both firstly the raw risk and the residual risks are, which will give you a degree of severity, but we weren't intending to rank them per se. So, for example, if one was to come out with a very high residual risk, I guess this committee would consider that a high priority strategic risk. But beyond
when
that...
do you talk about the probability of this risk actually happening? When does that come into the equation?
So the risk ratings are determined on the basis of both consequences and probability to give you a risk rating.
Yeah, I understand that. So is that at the next meeting?
So not for all of them. We will present them progressively as they're completed. Some of them are near completion. But there will be, as part of the template that we've created for presentation, the details of both the raw and the residual risk ratings for that strategic risk.
And that's why I thought they may be ranked, because some of the risks are higher than others and they have more probability of occurring than others.
That they will be like that, but we won't be specifically ranking them, because some of them will potentially, for example, some may all come, there may be 2 or 3 that come out simply as medium, and the degree of ranking with those 3, would that all be the same effectively based on their residual risk rating?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I believe exhausted questions. So we have a modification to the recommendations. Councillor Barrett, seconded by Councillor Fitzgerald, have added that Council adds loss of public institutions to the strategic risk statement. And then secondly, we've got the recommendation in the paper that the Council agree the strategic risk statements in attachment 1 in the memorandum titled Setting Council's Strategic Risks, presented to this committee on the 6th March 2024. Wade, go ahead, make a comment.
Through the Chair, just to make a comment on the additional recommendation, loss of trust in public institutions. These are the strategic risks for Palmerston North City Council. So public institutions goes much broader than the City Council. Just wondering if you wanted to consider.
Feel free. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, and to the Chief Executive for raising that. And I'm relatively relaxed in terms of where it goes. I'll lay out my thinking in terms of why public institutions was to my mind appropriate, but if the kind of balance of comment in the room is otherwise, I'm happy to see it amended. First off, to say I think it's a good start. Actually, I like the 10 things that are on the list. I think there's definitely some work to be done to flesh that kind of stuff out. I appreciate the officers acknowledging that it's a draft and a starting point. When I sit back and think about strategic risks to this organization and to more broadly, democracy and how we actually do society in 2024, loss of trust in all public institutions is of concern to me. And so, yes, we have our own, evidence around that in terms of our community surveys, in terms of voter turnout, et cetera, around where those numbers are tracking within the community. But, across the board, we see trust in public institutions deteriorating, and that includes central government, education, health, et cetera. So my thinking was to identify that there is a broader risk and that we face a subset of those consequences and risk within ourselves as council. But if the mood of the room is that should say loss of trust in council, I'm also reasonably relaxed on that. I would like to, one way or another, see this make it onto the register, because I do think it is a significant consequential risk that we, as elected members, certainly need to be aware of. And I feel a little bit like this meeting so far is kind of the confluence of two rivers that flow in quite different ways. The quite structured discipline of risk analysis, which has its own lexicon and its own analytical frameworks, and which adds value. So I'm not being critical of it. I'm just saying that it's kind of trying to blend that in with how we exist as a representative body of a community, and how we give voice to that representation and community desire. And I think on both the community side and the council side, trust is a key thing for us to focus on, and is something that the evidence tells us there is risk around, and that some of that risk is material and some of that risk is eventuating, and that it needs a response. So that's why I'm asking you for your support to see it added to this. And again, a bit relaxed, quite relaxed about whether it's council or broader public institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Harpeta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great. I first off, I fully support the strategic risk register. I think there's been some very good work done on it, and it's good to see it come to this committee in its draft format. And I'm looking forward to the next sort of work that's going to be done about the probability and the way it's going to go forward. Regarding the recommendation that Councillor Barrett's put forward, I can't support it, because it is public institutions means many things. That could be a bank down the road. It could be any institution that's a public institution. So for me, it's too broad. So I really can't support it for that reason. Not just because it's too broad. If you wanted to pare it back, I'd be happy about that. But I'm not because it is. It could be UCOL. It could be whatever other public institution you want to name, but because you have left it quite broad, I'm not comfortable with it putting it on the risk register. So I won't be supporting that recommendation. If we can put them separately, Chair, I'd be happy with that. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor. Councillor Naylor.
Mr Chair, yep, I'm also comfortable with what's been proposed in this paper and am also supportive of what councillor Barrett has proposed, although I do think it does need a word change. Whether councillor Barrett is happy to do that or whether that requires an amendment, but I would suggest loss of public trust in council would be perhaps appropriate if the mover and seconder are happy to change that. I think that better reflects what it is that we can actually mitigate and what we can have some level of influence over. So I'm happy for that to be included. I'm very supportive of that. Thanks.
Thank you, councillor. I think we have some support from councillor Barrett to, and Fitzgerald to amend that wording. Councillor Zabelin.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Likewise, I'm happy to support both. I've just done a little sort of deep dive for my own clarification as to some of the different terminology in terms of what differentiates a risk driver from an actual risk and then a risk consequence. And in considering this proposed recommendation, I think that it can fit across all three of those definitions. It can be a consequence, but it can also be a factor, and it can actually be an actual risk depending on how it's happening. But with the public flavour, the way things are going more widely, but also the consistently declining results in our resident survey, leads me to think that it is both a driver and a consequence and therefore an actual risk. So I think we would be remiss not to be considering this as a strategic risk to our organisation. And I think that is to some extent fuelled by a wider loss of trust in public institutions. So I wouldn't object to that wording either, but I'm also happy to support it being specified to our specific organisation. But very happy to support both. Thank you.
Thank you, councillor. My own view is that I would support both recommendations, and I think that the challenge now is for the management team to put in place a process within the team where there's a clear line of sight on who owns the risk in the business, what the mitigations are, what the key activities are to mitigate that risk to a level that elected members find acceptable, and on an ongoing basis at quarterly meetings to be able to report back on that activity and give a level of confidence around the risk management in the business. So I see this as an important start, and for that reason I'm very supportive of both recommendations. There are no further comment. Oh, Councillor Barrett, did you want to add anything?
Just the briefest right of apply to acknowledge and thank the Chief Executive for bringing a bit of focus into it and colleagues that worked it into that channel. So I hope that those online can see that the words have now been changed to loss of public trust in council and would ask for your support. Thank you.
Okay. Notwithstanding that, we will take both these recommendations separately. Oh, okay. So we'll vote on recommendation 1 around the loss of public trust in council. And that is carried 9-4 and 1 against. And we'll go to the second part of that recommendation now and put that to the vote.
Moved by yourself? Or?
Moved by myself and seconded, I think, by Councillor Naylor. Yeah. Yep. And that's carried 9-4 and none against, no abstentions. Thank you. I'd now like to move, noting our constraints on time, to agenda item 13, and then after that we'll take agenda item 14. So I'd like to ask Connie Roos and Wayne Wilson to the table, please. And I think Danielle is online? Good, okay, welcome. In your hands.
Tēnā koutou. I just would like to say that it's good to report that in terms of our planning for the last quarter, we are progressing as expected. With maybe worth noting that some of our uptake has increased quite significantly in terms of the biannual health and eye checks, as well as the utilisation of the wellness space. So on that note, I would like to accept that everyone has read the report and that I'm happy to answer any questions.
Councillors, questions? Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks Connie and Wayne. Just a very quick question, just in terms of the lost time in days on page 131, are we able to track that over a longer time period?
Yes. How long would you, what sort of period?
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to get at here is that it doesn't give me a sense of whether or not we're actually improving or declining in terms of that particular measure.
Yeah. No, we can do it much for any time period you would sort of suggest. But just in that last quarter, it was exceptionally low compared to normal. So, and the reason for that was there were a lot fewer accidents in that period, and people who'd been on long-term accidents had either come back to work or finished. So yeah, it was just an unusual period.
Yeah, thank you. And like I note that like if you look across the 8 records there, there's you know, some above 300, some below. I think it's 4 and 4. So do we have an understanding of how that might compare with other similar organisations to us proportionally per capita of work FTEs?
We do get some information from ACC in relation to through the different fees that we have to pay. I could look at that and give you a comparison with that, if that would help. But in the past, we've been slightly higher than the average. But I'd have to look to check to see what the current data is telling us.
Thanks, Wayne. And so we'll be able to work those kind of details that we've just talked about into our next report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Just looking at the top of page 129, enhanced wellbeing, the courses there, creating respectful workplaces, etc. Is that training available to elected members?
I'm pretty sure we can make a plan to make that happen.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Sorry, my question was just around exit interviews. So, would it be possible for you to provide some insight from exit interviews into this report? Just not details, obviously, and nobody to be identified, but just maybe some themes so that we could understand some of the reasons for, I mean, I acknowledge turnover is decreasing, and that's great, but it would be good to be able to understand some of the reasons for turnover.
Yes, so the plan is that we will start reporting on exit interview data in this report. So I am working with the business assurance team to start reporting on that. There was a few administrative issues that we had to sort out, and it's really great at this stage to report that we have figured out the issues and we are getting more data in, which should enable us to start reporting on those matters.
So maybe for the next report, you're thinking?
Yes, that is
Okay.
the plan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What's the highest job turnover in council?
Sorry. What's the, sorry, could you?
Well, the area, say, is it parking wardens or?
Thinking, tried to sort of look at that and say, look, which units have the highest, and it isn't, yeah, so there were finance and infrastructure were sort of the highest ones. In terms of jobs, I'd have to look at that. Are you looking for sort of a function?
Yeah, I guess specific area that is,
Yep.
is the highest turnover, and is council addressing that?
Oh, we're always looking at
Yeah.
where turnover is, yeah, and looking to see what the issues are that could be causing that.
Right.
The majority of them are external factors in terms of, yeah, when the market changes, that's when you get turnover.
Okay.
I do think that you know, that general saying, you join a company and leave a boss, can sometimes be a factor, but that's not, you know, that's not what I really think happens here.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Actually, I'll just make a comment there as well. The work, thank you. I was going to say CEOs, but anyway, the workforce has changed quite considerably over the years. So the type of workforce you have now is actually quite a lot more transient than what they used to be back in my day. So we do have some staff that have been in their roles for quite a considerable number of years. Just had somebody leave after 40 years service with council. Got somebody celebrating their 40th in the next week, but they are the minority now by some stretch. So even though we might be looking at specific roles and trends, we certainly have a workforce now that moves around quite a lot more than they ever used to.
Thank you. That is the end of questions. We have a recommendation that the committee receive the memorandum titled Wellbeing Report, October to December 2023, Quarter 2, presented to the Risk and Assurance Committee on the 6th March 2024. Happy to move that. Seconder, Councillor Naylor. Open for any commentary or comments. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I think overall a really good report, and in particular, I think it's a really positive trend, seeing that reduction in turnover. I think turnover is a really good reflection on the job satisfaction and the culture in a place, and to see it go from 20% at the beginning of last year to 15% at the beginning of this year, I think is quite a significant shift. So I think that's really positive. And just for Councillor Arnott's benefit, there is a chart at the top of page 131 with a breakdown of the turnover by unit that might be of interest. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. There are no further comments, so we'll put this recommendation to the vote. And that recommendation is carried unanimously. We'll now go to agenda item 14, and we'd welcome Selwyn Ponga Davis to the table. I'd also remind members that the questioning at this part of the report should be held at a granular or non-granular level, but that we will revert and deal with any specific questions in the part 2 of this meeting, the confidential part of the meeting. So Selwyn, we're in your hands.
Kia ora tātou, te iwi o rangitāne tēnā koe. Te rangatira, the chair, te tumu matua tēnā korua, councillors, business leaders, staff, tēnā koutou katoa. Since my last report, we've had continued increase in our health and safety maturity, which is really pleasing. We're well supported by the police, having frontline workers still having challenging times, but the police have been really supportive, and we've taken some affirmative action to poor customer behaviour. We have recently received accreditation from industry, 2 accreditations, which reflects our good positive journey in the health and safety space. Happy to take questions. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Selwyn. Questions? Selwyn, I have a question.
Yes.
I note in your reports that there have been incidents of pipe line excavation breaches, and I'd just like to understand, they're reported as near misses, but in your view, are they high risk, significant potential events?
Oh, absolutely. Against our critical risk profile, we have 12 critical risks around, especially around plant and energy. Some of those incidents involve contractors. So the approach that we take is that we ask that they do a robust investigation, either ICAMs or FOIs investigations. Just keep us abreast of investigations, and any learnings obtained, we release those through reports out to our staff, and especially in our infrastructure space.
Okay. It seems to me that given that they are high potential events, given that it seems to me in your report, a relatively high frequency, and I've observed historically that these things are happening, it seems to me that we probably need to be rethinking and addressing the root cause and trying to eliminate these events. So what is it that we need to do differently?
I think within our infrastructure space, we are working really well. We have occasions where the service plans that are provided to us are not correct. So in a recent event, hitting a power cable, those cables weren't identified to us. So I think we need to work more closely with our energy company and insist that we have standovers in some of the works that we do to give assurance to our teams.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Selwyn. Just briefly, there's some commentary here at a general level, so I think I can base the question around that rather than needing the Part 2 information, but I'm just interested around the trespass situations, and I'd like to know what we do as council to support staff in terms of their ability to identify trespassed individuals, especially in kind of complex environments like libraries or buildings that have kind of multiple entrances and people coming and going all the time. How do we help all the staff actually identify those people and respond?
Sure. Through the chair, good question, councillor. From our perspective, we look after the platform in terms of measuring how many trespassers we have. I'd like to call Jason just to come and support. So a procedure was developed around trespass and how it's applied. And I work closely with Jason, the security advisor, to undertake the training. So I'll hand you over to Jason.
Thank you, Councillor. So we've developed a trespass procedure or protocol around allowing our frontline staff to be able to immediately verbally trespass any individual from our facilities if they feel unsafe and it's in line with the safety plan or the tolerance of behaviour at the site. So, for example, working in conjunction with the health and safety team to work with those frontline staff in the leadership teams to identify what the triggers are and where they need to get to. This also aligns with the being able to push an activation through to our alarm company, particularly front of house as an example, where they're able to activate
a pendant that goes straight through to our alarm centre, but that also goes to the police directly where they've been able to respond. And there's an incident that is detailed later on in the confidential area that that refers to. After a period, after that actual initial response takes place, there's a review that's undertaken by the health and safety team alongside the site manager and my security advisor, including legal, where we will look at reviewing the whole situation and make a decision as to whether that period of time is suitable. And it could be that there's been a reaction to something that's happened, and for example, their dog being impounded, and their behaviour is in relation to that particular event, and the pressure that's in that space. So it could be that, are we looking at that they've gone away for that period of time, and then come back and their behaviour is modified to be what's within our expected periods of time. If somebody was to come back into the space after they've been verbally trespassed, the team can certainly communicate with us, but they have that ability to contact the police to inform that they've been verbally trespassed and that they're on site and need to be escorted off to help keep the staff safe. And there are some situations where a longer period of trespass in a written form is absolutely required to help keep our staff safe.
Thanks. I think that paints quite a picture to help me understand. I guess the further thing I was trying to get at is kind of how staff are kind of advised of that. So, you know, if it's like right before a shift change or somebody kind of comes back on, like, how is awareness transferred within staff so that they're all kind of up with the play in terms of where things are at around trespass?
At each site, certainly in our library space, they're very good at communicating around if somebody that they have that has entered into that space is made aware, certainly to the team leaders who are responsible for their areas or their people at that space. There'll be others, given some of the circumstances, they may know that individual a little bit more closely. They will certainly be aware of those individual circumstances or the individual themselves. Certainly at some of the other sites, there's obviously their team meetings that they communicate that with.
Great, thanks. That is helpful. Thank you both.
Just further to that, Councillor, it's also identified in the specific site safety plans, the trespass process, and we've just developed a new situational awareness program, and we talk further around trespass.
Great, thank you. Thank you both, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Arnott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, thank you, gentlemen. When a contractor causes damage to council infrastructure, who pays for the repair?
Through the chair, generally the contractor. If he causes damages to services, the bill goes back to them.
Well, I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Selwyn. Just a question about what is in place to safeguard staff who are perhaps working through maybe a contentious public consultation or public issue. I'm just thinking about the recent submissions that we had over positions of bus stops, and wondering how, when we have one or two members of staff that are working on an issue like that might be getting quite a lot of abuse from members of the public, what we do to safeguard those members of staff in terms of their mental and physical safety.
Through the chair, what was developed was a frontline charter for all our staff to help them understand that they're empowered to reach out to us as an organisation, specifically to the managers, if they're having difficulties, and if they need support, the support is there for them. All they need to do is reach out.
Okay. So if threats were made against a member of staff in that scenario, you'd expect them to reach out to the health and safety team?
I'd expect them to call the police,
Okay.
quite frankly. if they feel that they're in danger, they should call the services that they need. But certainly keep us in the loop, and we'll make sure we've got some wraparound working with Connie as well in terms of their wellbeing.
Okay, but I guess the impetus for anything to be done sits with the member of staff themselves. So, in other words, if the member of staff themselves that's dealing with the particular issue, if they don't ask for help, then there's no kind of there's no protocol in which someone else might be involved in assisting or providing support or whatever. It has to come from the staff member themselves.
Through the Te Tumu Mātua's executive statement, he empowered everybody to speak up, stand up, where there's incidents of any poor behaviour. If a staff member was coming across that type of event and another staff member was aware of it, we expect every staff member to stand up for their colleague and just let us know. We can only support them if we all are involved in clear communications and just reaching out.
And how often would you say that message is reinforced to staff? Is that a regular message that's sent out?
Yeah. It's clearly articulated on our health and safety boards in terms of what Te Tumu Mātua offers to our staff, and also through the safety charter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. There are no further questions, so I'd like to move the recommendation that the committee receive the memorandum, health and safety report, as presented to the Risk Insurance Committee on the 6th of March, and that the Chief Executive release the memorandum and attachments 1 and 3 as soon as practicable. Seconder, Councillor Naylor. Are there any comments from elected members? No, there are no comments. Oh, Councillor Johnson. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, just a quick comment, really. In that I think that there has been a step change in the health and safety in the last wee while. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that in the chamber. I'm feeling much more reassured, I must say, by the level of reporting and by the, by the answers that we're getting to questions, and by the frameworks, I guess, that are in place. So I just wanted to acknowledge that publicly, and yeah, well done.
Thank you, Councillor. There are no further comments, so we'll put this recommendation to the vote. And that's been carried unanimously. I think at this point it would be wise to deal with part 2 of the meeting, the confidential session, so that we can deal with any specific questions that arise in the health and safety area. So could we do that now? Yep. So I need a recommendation. So I'd like to move the recommendation to exclude the public as set out in that recommendation for each of those matters identified. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Naylor. Very good. We'll put that to the vote. And that is carried unanimously. So now, are we ready to go?